All right, let's start learning about functions. Before we do, we're going to create a new folder where we can put all of our function-related files, as the basics directory is getting a little crowded. I'm actually going to switch the folder that I have open in the Visual Studio Code editor. I'm going to open from the desktop my JS Bootcamp folder directly. Then, alongside of basics, I'm going to make a new directory, and I'm going to call this one functions. And in here, we're going to create our very first file, and we can just call this one functions101.js. Excellent. Let's also go ahead and switch the directory we're running our commands from. I'm going to use cd ... to go up a folder into the JS Bootcamp directory, then / functions to end up in the functions folder, and then I'll just use clear to clear the terminal output. So, as I mentioned in the intro, functions are little sub-programs. It's a little bit of code we can run over and over again. And there are three important parts to a function. Right here we have the function, we have the function input, we have the actual code to run. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to convert a temperature, fetch a user, print a message? And we have the output. We're going to ignore the input and the output for the moment, and we're just going to focus on creating our first function, a function that runs some code. We're going to do that right down below. We're going to use let like we would if we were to make a string, number, or Boolean. Let greet user, that's what I'm going to call this function, and I'm going to set it equal to, and this is where we have to use the function syntax. So much like the if statement, there is a specific set of rules around defining a function. We have to follow those. The first one is to use the function keyword. We literally type out function. The next is to open and close a set of parentheses. We're going to talk about what goes in here later. For now, though, it's perfectly fine to leave it empty. And then we are going to open and close a set of curly braces and hit enter. And there we have it, our very first function. Does it do anything? No, but it is indeed valid. So much like our if statements have a code block where we can put the code we want to run, like for example, right inside of here, our functions also have a code block that creates its own scope right here. Anything we want to do when the function executes goes right inside of here. For the moment, we're just going to go ahead and use log to print a message. Later on, we'll figure out how to convert a temperature, combine variables, call other functions, or do whatever else we need to do. In here, what are we going to do? We are just going to print a little message to the screen. Welcome, user. Excellent. Now that our function actually does something, we can't run the file just yet. Well, we could run the file, but the function's never going to execute. At this point, we've defined a function. Defining a function would be like defining a JavaScript file. Yes, it exists, but you haven't actually done anything with it. If we want this code to run, when we execute this file, we have to call it. So if I were to execute the script, node functions101.js, what do I get? I don't get an error, I just get nothing. The program didn't run. If I do want to run this little subprogram, I have to call the function. Right here, I execute it by referencing it by name, so greet user. This alone isn't enough. I have to use the function call syntax, which is an opening and closing parenthesis after the name. Now, we'll talk about what goes inside of here a bit later too. For now, it's perfectly fine to leave it empty. If we save the file and rerun things, what do we get? We get welcome user printing to the screen, which is fantastic. We have created and called our very first function, and we can call this function as many times as we see fit in our program. So I could paste that line 2 more times, and what's going to happen if I run the script? I'm going to see our welcome user message 3 times, and that's exactly what I get. With the most basic function accomplished, let's go ahead and create something a little more practical. We are going to introduce the input, the code, which we already have, and the output. For this one, let's say we want to square a number. So what do we take into the function? We take in the number we want to square. What does the code do? The code squares the number. What's the output? The output would be the squared number. So if I passed in 3, the code would multiply 3 times 3, and the output would be 9. Let's go ahead and see that in practice down below. I'm going to use let to create square, I'm going to set it equal to a function, so we use the function keyword. We open and close our parentheses, and we open and close our code block using curly braces. Down below, we can also go ahead and call this before filling it out. Square, and I'm going to pass in a number. Now, how do we pass a number into a function? Well, we do this by providing what's known as an argument. So the input, in terms of how the vocab works for JavaScript, it's actually known as an argument or arguments plural. So if you read a blog post on a function, you're not going to see input thrown around. You're going to see argument. So if we want to pass an argument into square, the value to square, how do we do that? Well, we provide it right here between the parentheses. So if I wanted to provide a number, I could literally just put a number right here. I could say 3, for example, or I could reference a variable that stores the number. So I could have a variable up above, let num equal 3, and then I could reference that variable instead of just putting 3 right in there. Both of those have the exact same effect, and for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to stick with passing in 3 right there. Let's go ahead and delete this line completely, and we're back to where we started. So at this point, we are passing in a single argument to square. We're passing in the number 3. The question is, how do we actually get access to this value inside of the function code? Well, we do that by naming the value right here in the parentheses for the function definition. So much like we would name a variable, we go ahead and name the argument right here. We can call this one num. Let's go ahead and actually do something with num to make sure the value is getting passed in correctly. Right here, console.log, I'm just going to print out num. We'll focus on squaring the number in just a second. If I save the file and rerun it, I would expect to see welcome user 3 times, and then I would expect to see 3 a single time. Let's go ahead and rerun the file, and that is exactly what we get. Right here, the argument value is getting passed in. We are seeing 3 get passed into the function, and when we print it, what are we getting? We're getting the value. We are getting 3. Now we can add multiple calls to square as well. I could call square right here with 10 if I wanted to, and now if we rerun the script, the first time the function runs, the value will be 3, and the second time the function runs, the value will be 10. Over here, we get 3, we get 10. So this is how we can set up basic input. We'll learn more about passing in multiple values later and what to do if a value isn't passed in. For now, we're going to stick with a more trivial setup. So what do we do from here? We square the number. We focus on the code side of things. We can do that right here. I'm going to call this one result equal, and all I'm going to do is take the number and multiply it by, using the asterisk sign, what? The number. So num times num. Now we have this result. So in the case of 3, it would be 3 times 3, which would be 9. In the case of 10, it would be 100, 10 times 10. So we have the input, our arguments. We have the code that actually does something. The last piece is the output. And the output is also known as the return value. So just like if you read an article on functions, you won't see input, you'll see arguments. You're not going to really see anyone call the function return value the output, but that is an easy way to think about the 3 pieces. It's really called the return value, and that's because to return something, we have to use the return statement. So right here, how do we do that? Well, we type out return. This is a reserved keyword in the language, and it can be used a single time only in your functions. So right here, we can choose to return a single value from this function. What's that value going to be? It's going to be result. So we reference it, result right here. Now we have a function that does all 3 things. It takes in some value as the argument, it uses some code to do something meaningful, and then it returns a value. In this case, it returns the squared value. Now, if we were to run the program in its current state, it wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't see any output related to our second function. Right here, we get 3 instances of welcome user, but we don't get 9 or 100 printing. That's because the return value isn't being used. So let's figure out how to use it, and then we'll move on to a challenge where you'll need to create a function of your own. What I'm going to do right here on line 16 is create a variable. So let value equal, and then on the right-hand side, as the thing to store in value, I'm going to keep the function call. So this is the setup we use to call a function with an argument and then store the return value. So the end result of this is the return value, and here we're just putting it in a variable. We can do the same thing down below for square 10. Let's go ahead and actually do that. Right here, let other value equal, and then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to get the value back from calling square with the number 10. The end result, 100. Now we can actually print both of these to the screen, console.log value. And you'll notice something. Log is indeed a function. We're calling it with some parentheses, and we're passing in an argument. Whatever argument we pass in gets printed to the console. So now we know a little bit about this line. We still don't know what the dot part is and the console up in front, but we can at least break down this piece right here. On the next line, console.log, other value. Then all we're going to do is save the program and see what happens when we run it. I'm going to rerun the script, and this time around we are getting welcome user 3 times. We're then getting the number 9, which is the correct result, and the number 100, also correct. So there we have it. We have a function that has a set of arguments, a number. We got our code, we have our output. When we want to call a function, we reference it by name with some parentheses on the end. In there, we can pass in the input we want to provide to the function. And if we want to do something with the return value, we can just put the function call over here with a variable set up beforehand. Now that we've seen all of this in practice, I want you to create a function on your own as the challenge for this video. So down below, a little challenge area is indeed appropriate. For this challenge, you're going to be creating a function called convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. And as the name suggests, this function is going to take in as the argument the temperature in Fahrenheit. It's then going to run the conversion algorithm, and it's going to return the temperature in Celsius. So after you create the function, you're going to call it. Down below, call a couple of times. And if you want some sample values, 32 should get converted to 0. And then another good one would be 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which should get converted to 20 degrees Celsius. Then the last thing you're going to do is print the converted values. So this is very similar to what we just did above. We defined our function. We then called the function a couple of times, and then we did something with the return value. That's exactly what you're going to be doing down below. Define the function, call it, do something with the returned value. If you forget how to convert the temperature, don't worry. You can just use the temp conversion project that you created before. You have the algorithm sitting right up top. If you don't have that file anymore, you can always download it. It's available in the lecture zip for every single lecture. All right, take some time to knock this one out and then go ahead and test your work. When you run the program, you should see 0 and 20 at the bottom, assuming you're using the same 2 input values I set up right here. Pause the video, and when you're done, click play. How'd that go? Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. I'm going to kick things off by defining the function up above. I already have the variable name typed out, so I'm just going to remove the 2 slashes and toss let up front. I'm then going to set this equal to a new function. Got my function keyword, my arguments list, and the code to run. Now there is going to be a single argument for this one. The name you picked isn't particularly important as long as it's meaningful. So maybe you went with temp. I'm going to go ahead and go with Fahrenheit. Next up, we need to actually do the conversion process. I have to get the value in Celsius. We already have that code sitting right over here, so I can actually just take that algorithm, copy it, and paste it right in here. Now, it's important to remember, this algorithm references some variables like Fahrenheit, but that's okay because we have Fahrenheit defined up above. So we actually don't need to change anything about this line. What's the next thing we want this function to do? We want it to return the converted value. So down below, we can wrap up our function by using return. What are we trying to return? We're trying to return the temperature in Celsius. Now we can move on to the second stage, which is to actually call this a couple of times. So right here, let temp1 equal And we can go ahead and use our function convert, and you can see that the auto completion is actually picking up on the function that we created. And right here, we can just click that to auto complete it, and then we can pass in the value. I'm going to pass in 32 degrees for the first one. Let's go ahead and duplicate this line. I'm going to go ahead and highlight the whole thing, copy it, and paste it down below. And now what we're going to do is define temp2 for the second call, and we'll change the value. Let's go ahead and change it over to the other sample data I gave you. That was 68. The last thing to do is to print those two values. So console.log temp1, and down below that, console.log passing in temp2. With this in place, we can remove those comments and we can go ahead and test our work. Let's cross our fingers and hope everything works as expected. Right here, I'm going to rerun the script, and the only two values we care about are the last two values, the logs that come from the challenge. Right here, we're getting 0 for the first one, which is correct, and 20 for the second one, also looking good. So there we have it. This was a quick rundown on the basics of functions. Now at this point, you probably still have a ton of questions. For example, can I pass in multiple values? What happens if I call a function and don't pass in the arguments it expects? We're going to get to all of that in this section. At this point, what I wanted to explore is the basic syntax. The fact that when we create a function, we have our arguments, the code, and our return value. We've seen that in a couple of different situations. Let's continue on to the next video and start exploring some of the details. I'm excited to get to that. I'll see you then.